He hadn't spoken a word to a soul in half a year. The desert had taken everything: his father, his faith, his voice. But on a morning like any other, a shadow moved in his storeroom. And when Clay raised his rifle, he wasn't staring down a bandit. He was staring at a woman unlike any he'd ever seen. A towering Apache warrior with the hunger of 6 months burning in her eyes. What started as survival cracked open something else, something neither of them were ready for. Clay was alone, not the kind of alone that visits you and leaves with the evening dust, but the kind that digs roots, builds a home in your bones, and sits in your chest like a stone. Ever since his father died last spring, Clay had lived on the edge of the Pecos borderland in a ranch house built for 2, and filled by none. The silence was thick out there, so thick it felt alive. He worked sunup to sundown, talked only to his horses, and hadn't touched another human being since the frost came. Each dawn, he rose to the same landscape, the mesquite stretching like twisted fingers across the hardpan, the dry wind whispering through broken fences, the cattle lowing like ghosts too stubborn to move on. He didn't mind the work. The work gave him shape. The work made him forget. What he couldn't forget was the echo that followed every chore, every meal, every nightfall. It was the echo of nothing. But somewhere beyond that silence, there was another kind of hunger stirring. Tula had been walking the high desert for 6 months. Not drifting. Hunting. Not for deer or grain, but for answers, for vengeance, for something she couldn't name that gnawed at her belly and her heart. She'd lost people, her people. And what little pride the army hadn't burned out of her, the starvation had carved away. She hadn't eaten a full meal since the rains. Her ribs ached. Her fingers had learned to steal again. The law didn't reach this deep into the territory, and even if it did, it never reached for someone like her. She spotted the ranch long before he spotted her. A clean water barrel, horses well fed, a storeroom patched just enough to say someone still cared. A place worth risking. So before the first sun broke the sky, she crept in like a shadow. And that's when Clay heard it. The scuff of boots across floorboards, the quiet rustle of burlap. He should have fired on instinct. Red Wolf Gang had been spotted 2 valleys over, and men out here didn't survive by hesitating. He raised the rifle, finger to the trigger, aimed for the heart. But then the figure stepped into the shaft of light spilling through the crooked door, and Clay froze. Not a man. A woman. Tall, strong, raven braid down her back, leather worn to the bone, her eyes dark as storm clouds, and every inch of her body whispered war. But she wasn't moving to hurt him. She was stealing. Calmly, deliberately, with a kind of dignity that knocked the air from his chest. He should have shouted, should have run her off, should have fired a warning shot. Instead, all he said was, "Wait." She stopped mid-step, turned slightly, just enough for the morning sun to catch the scar on her jaw. And those eyes, still sharp, still watching. "You don't have to steal," he said, voice cracked from disuse. "Take what you need. Just don't come back." No thanks. No apology. She slung 2 more sacks of grain across her back and walked out. Close enough for him to smell smoke and sage on her skin. Close enough that Clay, for the first time in months, forgot the weight of his own name. She disappeared into the cottonwoods like a ghost. But 50 yards out, she stopped, looked back, and something in her chest shifted. Something dangerous, something curious. Clay didn't sleep that night. The silence he'd once trusted betrayed him, became a buzzing thing. Every creak of wood made him reach for the rifle. Every shadow at the fence line made him wonder if she'd returned. And worse, if he wanted her to. If that fire's still burning in you, partner, don't ride off just yet. Subscribe now to catch the next chapter of Clay and Tula's unraveling bond. Every silence has a heartbeat, and theirs is just getting louder. Some ghosts knock, others just walk right in. The sun hadn't yet burned the chill off the ground when Clay stepped out onto the porch, boots creaking against the warped planks. His breath showed in small puffs. Another cold morning. Another day of fighting the land, the silence, and himself. He reached for the old coffee pot, but something felt off. The stillness wasn't right. Too still. No wind in the brush, no creak of the barn door. The kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but from someone holding their breath. That's when he saw it. The storeroom door, swaying slightly in the breeze. Clay's stomach dropped. He moved quiet. Years of ranch life had taught him not to waste movement. Rifle in hand, he crossed the yard with slow, silent steps, the dirt crunching just a little too loud beneath his boots. The Red Wolf gang had been nosing through the backcountry again. Word in Dry Creek was they'd already taken a horse trader's place clean off the map. Clay wasn't about to be next. The storeroom stood half in shadow, the morning light crawling across the warped boards like it didn't want to go in either. Clay pressed his shoulder to the wall, rifle barrel leading the way, heart hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. Inside, someone moved. Low, steady, shifting sacks of grain like they had all the time in the world. Clay stepped inside. The shadows moved with him. The air was thick with the scent of burlap, dry oats, and something else. Earth and smoke, the trace of someone who'd been living wild. He raised the rifle, sight lined up, breath locked in his throat. Then she stepped into the light. Taller than most men he'd met, shoulders squared like she'd never been taught to flinch. Her black braid swung low, the end frayed, leather and dust caked in the creases of her tunic. Her bow was slung high on her back. Her hands didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't dart. She just looked at him, like she was already planning how to take him down if she had to. And Lord help him, he didn't pull the trigger. Her name would come later. But standing there, surrounded by sacks of food and the ghosts of better years, Clay saw her not as a threat, but as a mirror. Same rawness, same desperation hiding behind the grit. "You Red Wolf?" he asked, voice rough as dry bark. No answer. She didn't blink. Just shifted her weight slightly, gripping the dried venison tighter. His finger trembled on the trigger, but his gut screamed something different. She wasn't raiding for gold or horses. She was surviving. Just like him. "You don't have to steal it," he said, the words tumbling out before he knew why. "Take what you need, just don't come back." For a beat, she didn't move. Just stared. Like she couldn't decide if this was a trap or a kindness too strange to trust. Then, slow as dusk, she reached for 2 more sacks. Slung them over her shoulder like they weighed nothing. Walked past him so close he caught the scent of sage, wood smoke, and something earthy. Real. She didn't thank him. Didn't flinch when he stepped back to let her pass. She disappeared through the door without a glance. But that wasn't the part that stayed with him. No. What stayed was the quiet echo of her footsteps, the heat of her passing, the way his trigger finger relaxed like it had never wanted to fire at all. He stood in the storeroom long after she was gone, the rifle hanging loose in his hands, the light slanting across the floorboards in soft gold ribbons. Outside, the day began like any other. But Clay's world had shifted an inch off-center. And out there, beyond the tree line, she stopped. Tula. She didn't know his name yet, but she remembered the way he'd looked at her. Not like a thief, but like a question he wasn't ready to answer. Her hunger had brought her here, but it was curiosity now that kept her from walking too far. Some mercy don't come wrapped in kindness. Sometimes it just don't come with a bullet. Clay didn't sleep much after she left. He laid in bed that night, staring at the warped ceiling planks, the sound of her footsteps still pacing through his skull. He hadn't meant to speak, hadn't meant to lower the rifle. But something in the way she stood there, unshaken, starving, but proud, had cracked something in him he didn't know was hollow. It wasn't pity, it wasn't fear, it was recognition. She was gone now, vanished into the cottonwoods, but the imprint of her stayed like a boot scuff on his chest. The next morning, the light came in hot and white. Clay stepped out with the rifle slung across his back, half hoping, half dreading he'd see her silhouette among the trees. He didn't. But his eyes kept drifting east toward the brush line. By noon, he'd checked the fence 3 times. The cattle were restless, snorting at nothing. The sky felt wrong, like it held its breath for something it couldn't name. Every crack of branch, every shift of wind made him reach, too fast, for the rifle. This is what happens, he thought, when you let something in. 3 days passed like this, haunted, unsettled. The food she'd taken wasn't what gnawed at him. It was the way she hadn't run, hadn't begged, hadn't even blinked when he aimed a rifle dead at her spine. And when he'd said, "Don't come back," he wasn't sure who he was trying to protect, her or himself. Late afternoon of the 3rd day, he was hauling fresh-cut cedar to patch the chicken pen when it hit him. That feeling. Not sound, not sight, just presence. A chill crawled down his spine despite the heat. He turned slow. There she was, half hidden at the tree line, arms folded back straight, watching. Clay's hands froze around the rail. His heart thumped once, hard, like a warning shot through his ribs. She didn't move. Didn't call out, just studied him with the same unreadable eyes. Cool, calculated, piercing. Not like she was stalking him. More like she was studying him. Like he was a riddle she meant to crack. He should have yelled, demanded to know what the hell she was doing back. Instead, he turned back to the pen and started hammering again, each strike ringing louder than it needed to. She stayed until sundown. He knew because he didn't look, but he felt it when she disappeared again. Like the world lost a layer of weight the second she was gone. The next morning she returned. Closer. She was sitting now, bold as brass, on a split log just shy of the property line, as if it was her ranch and he was the one trespassing. Clay stepped out with his coffee, squinting at her through the steam. She didn't wave, didn't nod, just stared. He set the cup down and walked toward her. Slow, cautious, unsure if it was curiosity or foolishness driving his boots. The distance between them closed to about 15 paces. An invisible line hung in the dust between them. Neither one crossed it. "You keep showing up," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. Her chin lifted slightly. "You keep not shooting me." That made his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but damn near close. She stood. The way she rose was all warning, smooth, quiet, full of power barely held in check. Taller than he remembered. Calloused fingers, scar on her jaw catching the light just enough to remind him she'd survived worse things than him. "You are not what I expected," she said. Clay blinked. "What did you expect?" "Violence," she answered plainly. "Cruelty, that's what most white men carry." He let that hang for a moment. "And yet," she added, voice cool. You gave me food. Let me walk away. She stepped forward once, just enough to make his pulse kick. Why? Clay swallowed, suddenly aware of how dry his throat was. You looked like you needed it more than I did. Something shifted in her face. Not soft, but less sharp. Less armor, maybe. Like the words hit a place inside her that hadn't been touched in a long while. She nodded once. Not approval. Not thanks. Just understanding. I'm Clay, he said. Her reply was quiet, but firm. Tula. The name settled in the air between them like dust after a storm. Tula turned, began to walk back towards the trees. But halfway there she paused, looked back, and in that one glance, Clay felt something low in his chest curl tight. Not fear, not desire, not yet. But something deep, something dangerous, something that didn't feel like the end at all. You can feel some stares like heat. Others feel like a knife slid slow between your ribs. By the fourth day, Clay had stopped pretending he wasn't looking for her. He tried to carry on, splitting fence rails, hauling feed, tightening the barn hinges before wind season set in. But his focus was shot. Every hammer swing felt off. Every footstep echoed too loud. He was working like a man trying to outrun his own mind. Tula hadn't come back after their last meeting. Not that she promised to, but damn if it didn't gnaw at him. That quiet retreat into the brush. Like she'd taken something with her when she left. Something he didn't know he was missing until it was gone. By midday, the sun was brutal, baking the dirt to brick. Clay was out at the far end of the West Corral, replacing warped slats with new-cut cedar when the feeling returned. Not a sound. Not a shadow. Just that feeling. The hairs on the back of his neck stood straight. His gut clenched like someone had drawn a cold knife across his spine. She was here. He didn't turn right away. Just let his hands keep working while his eyes scanned the tree line in his peripheral vision. There, halfway up the rise, tucked behind a cluster of pinon and shadow, she was standing motionless. Arms folded, one boot resting on a rock, her figure half swallowed by the forest. But her eyes were locked on him. Watching. Clay's hand slipped on the mallet. He cursed low and wiped the sweat from his brow. His heart thudded, not in panic, but in that slow, heavy way that meant trouble was coming, or already here. She didn't move, didn't wave, didn't blink. He tried to keep working, but each motion felt exposed, like he was being weighed, measured, studied, like she was trying to read something in the way he moved, the way he sweated, the way his shoulders rolled from years of solitary labor. And damn if it didn't make him feel naked. That night, he sat by the fire pit with a tin plate of beans untouched in his lap. The stars were out. The wind had picked up just enough to rustle the cottonwoods. But it wasn't the breeze he was listening for. It was footsteps. It was her. But she didn't come. Not that night. The next morning, Clay stepped out early, a coffee mug in one hand and his old rifle in the other. Not to use, but to carry. Like armor. Like comfort. And there she was again. Closer. Not hidden now. Not even pretending. She sat on a low boulder at the edge of the field, just beneath a cedar that threw long shadows across the dry grass. One knee drawn up, elbow resting atop it. Eyes fixed on him like he was a story unfolding. He let out a sigh. Set down the mug. Took a long time walking over. This time he didn't stop at the invisible line between them. He stepped right up to it. Still didn't cross, but close enough that he could see the subtle twitch of amusement in the corner of her mouth. "You always this quiet when you trespass?" he asked. Tula didn't flinch. "You always let thieves go with their arms full?" Clay shrugged. I guess I had a hunch you'd be back. She tilted her head, braid swaying against her shoulder. Why's that? Because I didn't scare you, and you didn't scare me. She stood slowly, fluid and tall, the sun catching the faint sheen of sweat at her collarbone. You're not what I expected, Clay, she said, and his name sounded different from her lips, like it belonged to someone else entirely. What were you expecting? Cruelty, she said, same as before. Indifference, the usual. He shifted his weight. And what did you find? She studied him for a long beat, something that makes no damn sense. The silence between them wasn't cold this time. It buzzed, like the air before a lightning strike. He cleared his throat. So what now? You tell me, she said. And before he could answer, she turned and walked off again, just far enough to keep him guessing. Her presence faded into the trees, but that question stayed behind like a brand seared into his chest. What now? There's a line between what a man wants and what he dares. But some women walk right up to it, and dare him anyway. The sun came up red and hard that morning. Not gentle like a spring dawn, but burning, like it had something to prove. Clay had been out since before it crested, feeding the horses, checking the southern fence where a wild steer had busted through days earlier. He wasn't expecting her. But then again, maybe he was. He saw her just before noon. Closer than ever. Not lurking now. Not a ghost. She stood near the old well at the edge of his land, boots planted, arms crossed, watching. No movement, no gesture, just presence. And it twisted something in his chest. Clay dropped the fence rail he was carrying, let it thud against the dust. Then he walked toward her, the heat clinging to his back like a second shirt. He didn't know what he was going to say. Hell, he didn't even know what he was feeling. But his boots kept moving. She didn't shift when he got close. Didn't blink. They stood 10 paces apart, a crooked piece of mesquite bush marking the invisible line between them, his land on one side, hers on the other. Neither crossed it. You're here again, he said. Tula's face was unreadable. You didn't tell me not to. He grunted. Figured that part was understood. Did you want me to stay gone? She asked, voice flat, almost sharp, not soft, not coy. Clay looked down at the dirt, then up again, met her eyes. No. That was the truth. She nodded once, slow, as if that settled something. But it didn't. It only made it worse. He felt it building, between them. The weight, the quiet, like something dammed up was starting to push against the walls. What are you doing here, Tula? He didn't ask like a man defending his land. He asked like a man who needed to understand something he couldn't name. Her answer wasn't what he expected. You're not what I expected. That stopped him cold. He frowned. What did you expect? More fear, she said. More anger. More reasons not to come back. He folded his arms. And now? Tula's gaze burned hot and steady. Now I want to know why. The words hung there, bold and unshaken. Clay stared at her, sweat beading at his temples. Why what? Why you didn't shoot, she said. Why you gave food to someone you should have feared. Why you talk to me like I ain't just some hungry Apache looking to take what ain't hers. Clay shifted his weight. The wind kicked dust across the line between them. He could have said a dozen things. He said the only one that mattered. Because you looked like you needed it more than I did. And because you didn't flinch. Tula's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. But it was something. You keep saying things that don't make sense, she murmured. He took half a step forward. Just half. The air snapped tight. "You crossed my land," he said. "You stole from me. You keep showing up like you ain't sure whether to kill me or help fix my fences. And I haven't run you off. I haven't drawn on you." "Why?" she shot back. He paused, then answered, "Because I'd rather try to understand you than bury you." That silenced her. The wind picked up, fluttering the edge of her faded leather sleeve. Then, she did something Clay wasn't ready for. She stepped forward. Just 1 foot. Crossed the boundary. Not far. Not aggressive. Just enough to make her point. Then she said, soft but firm, "So, understand this. I don't come back because I'm hungry. Not anymore." Clay's mouth went dry. The space between them narrowed into a tension so thick it felt alive. They stood there, inches from a line that wasn't drawn in dirt anymore. It was drawn in intent. "What's your name?" she asked. "I told you." "Clay." "No, not your name. Who are you, Clay?" That question held weight. Years of it, maybe lifetimes. He didn't answer, because he didn't know yet, and maybe that was the problem. She stepped back without waiting, turned, and headed towards the trees. The wind wrapped around her like smoke. She didn't look back this time. But Clay stayed there, right on that invisible edge, heart thundering like hooves in a canyon. That line wasn't just land anymore. It was him. Some folks talk their way into trust. Others earn it one fence post at a time. It started with the cattle. Clay came out that morning to find the west herd penned neatly. Too neatly. The gate latch had been reinforced with a second twist of wire, the kind he didn't remember setting. And one of the skittish yearlings, the one with a limp from last month's fence run-in, had salve rubbed into its leg. He hadn't done that. Didn't take long to figure out who had. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, he saw her, moving among the animals like she'd belonged there all along. Calm, measured, no wasted motion. One hand grazing a colt's neck, the other adjusting the feed barrel as if she'd fed these animals for years. Tula didn't look at him when he stepped into the corral. She didn't have to. Her awareness of him was like heat, present, steady, undeniable. "You fix my gate?" Clay asked, voice neutral. She nodded once. It was sloppy. He didn't argue. She was right. "You touched the red yearling too?" Her leg was weeping. Infection was close. I had bark poultice left. Clay stood there, thumbs hooked on his belt, studying her. "You a healer too?" "I know how not to let things die," she said, eyes still on the horses. That line hit deeper than it should have. Clay looked away. "Well," he muttered, "can't pay you, but I could use another pair of hands." Tula finally looked at him. "No need," she said. "I already started." That was how it began. No handshake, no deal, no spoken arrangement, just rhythm. They worked side by side through the morning, mending fences. The wire had split near the South Arroyo, where the land dipped hard and washed out after the last storm. Clay brought the mallet and fresh nails. Tula brought raw strength. She held posts steady while he hammered. He tied wire while she tamped dirt. They didn't talk much. Didn't need to. The work spoke loud enough. And in that silence, something started to take shape. Something truer than words. At one point, Clay glanced up to find her watching him. Not staring. Just taking him in. Measuring again. Judging not just his hands, but the man behind them. "You built this place alone?" she asked, eyes flicking to the barn and chicken shed. Clay nodded. "My father started it. I finished what he couldn't." Tula squatted beside a cracked post, her fingers trailing the grain like she was reading the wood's memory. "Hard to build something by yourself. Harder to keep it standing," Clay replied. That earned a glance from her, sharp, almost approving. As the sun climbed, they moved to the barn. There was a broken hinge on the south door, and Clay had been meaning to fix it for weeks. Tula didn't wait for him to ask. She just grabbed the toolbox and climbed up on the crate without a word. She moved like a woman who'd survived war, wilderness, and worse. Every motion efficient, grounded. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing strong, scarred forearms. Clay tried not to watch her too long, but it was like trying to ignore thunder. By mid-afternoon, sweat streaked both their skin. Dust clung to their clothes, hair, and boots. But neither of them looked tired. Not really. They broke at the well, taking turns with the dipper. When Tula handed it back to him, her fingers brushed his, just barely. But it was enough. Enough to pull some current from deep inside his ribs. Enough to remind him just how long it had been since someone touched him without needing anything in return. He didn't say a word. Neither did she. But the silence between them had changed. No longer heavy, just full. Like breath held between beats. As they leaned against the fence rail, Clay finally said, "You always this good at fixin' things?" Tula glanced sideways. "Only the things worth fixin'." The look she gave him after that made his throat go dry. Something about the way her gaze lingered. Not soft, but intentional, told him she wasn't just talking about barns or cattle anymore. He didn't know what this was yet, but he knew it wasn't nothing. Out here, the heat breaks stone before it breaks silence. But every man's got a crack line. Evening came slow, dragging the sun behind it like a dying horse. The kind of light that made the land glow with false peace. Honey gold over dust and shadow. Clay and Tula had worked all day, barely a dozen words between them. But the silence wasn't sharp anymore. It had changed, turned warm, dense, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. They sat now on the long log by the shed, sweat cooling on their skin, shirts stained with dust and effort. Clay rolled his shoulders, the ache familiar. Good. Honest. Tula sat just far enough not to touch, but close enough he could feel the heat of her beside him. She stared out across the corral like she was watching ghosts move through the dusk. 6 months, Clay muttered, not looking at her. She didn't respond. He let the words hang, but the silence didn't break them. Instead, they rippled, like something dropped in still water. 6 months since Pa died, he said. Since anyone talked back to me. Since I sat near somebody who didn't walk away first chance they got. Still no response. Just the faint clink of her belt buckle when she shifted. Clay dug the toe of his boot into the dirt. At first I told myself I liked it. The quiet, the routine. I knew what every hour looked like, what the sky would feel like, what animals needed feeding. I didn't have to feel nothing. He glanced at her. Tula hadn't moved. But he knew she was listening. Every part of her still, like a coiled spring that only moved when it chose to. But then it got inside me, he said, voice low. The silence, the nothing. It's like you walk into a room and don't know why you're there. Then you realize the room's in your own chest. Tula turned her head slightly. Her profile caught the last light. High cheekbones, a jaw set like iron, but eyes softer than he'd expected. You sound like a man who got what he wanted, she said finally, and learned he didn't want it at all. Clay gave a tired breath. Yeah, that's about right. For a long moment, they just breathed. Then she said, Loneliness ain't always punishment. Sometimes it's armor. He looked at her. And sometimes it's a prison. She didn't argue. The cricket started up. First one, then a chorus. Coyotes yipped in the far hills. The wind carried the scent of horses, sagebrush, and dry timber. It wrapped around them like memory. "I've seen worse things than quiet," she said at last, "but that don't mean I like it." He watched her now, really watched. The way her eyes didn't quite meet his, the scar at her jaw, the calluses on her hands, worn down not just from surviving, but from fighting to survive. "Why'd you come back?" he asked. Her jaw worked, tight at first. Then, "Because I couldn't stop thinking about how you lowered your rifle, and the way your voice cracked when you told me to take what I needed." She turned her full face to him then. "Men like you don't exist where I come from." Clay's throat went dry. "You say that like it's a good thing?" "I don't know what it is yet," she said honestly, "but I wanted to see if it was real." The words hit harder than they should have. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, stared down at his hands, cracked, calloused, dirt under the nails. "They taught me to be hard," she said softly. "To never need, never want. That was survival." She paused. "But you—" Her voice wavered, just a breath. "You don't talk like a man who wants to take. You talk like a man who's afraid to be given something." That tore him wide open. He looked at her then, straight on. Nothing clever, nothing masked. "I don't know what to do with any of this," he said. She gave a small smile, not warm, but true. "Neither do I." And that was the truest thing either of them had said. The last of the light bled out behind the ridge. Tula stood first, dusting off her hands. "Tomorrow?" she asked. Clay nodded. Yeah, as she walked back toward the trees, Clay felt that familiar ache crawl up his chest. But it wasn't loneliness this time. It was hope, a low, unfamiliar thing. And that was worse, because hope was soft, and soft things got killed out here. Some wounds don't bleed, they just echo, and sometimes a shared silence says more than any oath. The next morning came with a sky cracked wide in copper and fire. Clay was already at the barn, sleeves rolled, pitchfork in hand, when he heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind him. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Tula walked in like she belonged now, no longer a shadow passing through. Her stride was steady, her chin lifted, not defiant, just unafraid. He handed her the feed bucket without a word. She took it. They worked side by side all morning, him shoveling out stalls, her laying fresh hay, both moving like two parts of a wheel, long broken, but somehow turning again. By midday, the sun sat heavy overhead, and the air was thick with the scent of sweat, horses, and dust. Clay leaned against a post, wiping his brow. Tula stood near the water trough, sipping from a tin cup. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. Could eat. He led her back toward the cabin, boots dragging just enough to stir up little ghosts of dirt. Inside, the table was bare, save for a worn cloth and a tin plate. Clay rummaged through the cupboard and pulled out dried beans, jerked venison, and the last heel of cornbread from the night before. Not much. But he laid it out like it was Sunday supper. Tula sat. Watched him with those sharp, unreadable eyes that always seemed to be measuring not just what he said, but what he didn't. "I can cook," she offered, quiet but not unsure. Clay looked up, surprised. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. "If I'm staying, I ain't gonna just take." He stepped aside. Stove's yours." Watching her move around his kitchen was like watching a wild hawk settle on a fence post. Cautious, yet oddly at ease. She didn't fumble. She knew where things belonged, even if she'd never touched them before. "Learned to make do in worse places?" she murmured, breaking dry meat into the pot, adding water and herbs she'd carried in a pouch tied to her belt. "Once cooked soup from tree bark and crushed lizard bones." Clay raised a brow. "You serious?" She looked at him, straight-faced. "Dead." He chuckled. First time in days. She stirred the pot like it was holy work, and for a while the cabin filled with something that hadn't lived there in months. Warmth. Real warmth. When they sat to eat, it was quiet again, but not the brittle kind. This silence was soft, full, the kind that comes when two people trust the sound of breath over the weight of words. Halfway through, Clay cleared his throat. "You always travel alone?" Tula glanced up. "Not always. But those I ran with, they're gone." "Family?" She shook her head. "Tribe scattered. Brother taken. Ma died birthing my second sister. And Pa." Her jaw tightened. He fought it till he couldn't. Clay let that sit. He didn't push. "Yours?" she asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Ma passed quiet. Fever took her quick. Pa died slow, in pieces." Her gaze didn't flinch. "Drunk?" "Mean," Clay said. "Then drunk. Then sorry. Then mean again." She nodded once, like she'd met the type. "I built all this," he said, motioning to the cabin, the fields beyond. "To forget him. To outgrow him." "Did it work?" He met her eyes. "Not yet." Tula looked away, but her voice came soft. "Maybe forgetting ain't the point. Maybe it's what you do with the remembering." He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Because right then, the wind shifted, bringing the smell of storm from the south. Far off, maybe 2 days out. But it would come. And Clay knew, like he knew the weight of a spade or the creak of his saddle, that change was rollin' in with it. He looked at the woman across the table, braids loose, face half-shadowed, arms nicked with old stories. She wasn't a guest anymore, and he wasn't just surviving. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow either. The rain came like a whisper that grew teeth. By dusk, it was lashing the windows, turning the red clay outside to slick mud, swallowing hoofprints and footprints alike. Clay sat at the table, knife in hand, whittling a chunk of mesquite into something that wasn't trying to be anything at all, just a shape to keep his hands steady. Tula sat near the fire, legs drawn up, mending the sleeve of one of his old shirts. She had a needle like a weapon, fingers nimble, face steady. She hadn't asked to stay, and he hadn't told her she could. But somehow, the place breathed easier with her in it. Then came the knock. 3 slow raps against the door. Not urgent, not friendly either. Clay stood. Tula rose too, her eyes sharp, the firelight catching the tension in her jaw. He stepped to the door and opened it. A man stood in the rain, tall and lean with a coat soaked through and a pistol low on his hip. Another shape behind him, stockier, older, squinting through the wet. Both wore the look of riders who'd come far and not for small talk. "You Clay Vance?" the tall one asked, voice like gravel. Clay didn't answer. Not yet. The older man lifted his hat. "Name's Harper. This here's Boone Taggart. We're looking for someone." Tula stepped back, out of view. Clay's voice was low, measured. "Don't reckon I know you." "Don't reckon you need to," Boone said, brushing water off his collar. "We're looking for an Apache girl. She's wanted by Judge Silas Gant down in Red Mesa. Said she ran off with something that wasn't hers. Clay's jaw tensed. She got a name? Don't matter, Harper muttered. Only matters she's got a mark. 3 scars behind the left ear. Gant pays good for her return. Real good. Clay stared at them, stone still. You see anyone like that pass through? Boone asked. A pause stretched long. Then Clay spoke. Just me out here. Harper raised a brow. You sure about that? Clay's tone sharpened. You think I'm lying? You're welcome to take a step inside. But I promise you, you won't walk back out. Something cold passed between them. Boone's hand hovered near his holster. But Harper was older. Wiser, maybe. He nodded once. We'll be checking other homesteads. As they turned, Clay added, Tell Gant if he wants to hide behind bounty men, he ought to send better ones. Boone glared but said nothing. They rode off into the wet dark, hooves muffled by mud. Clay shut the door, locked it, turned slowly. Tula stood by the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel, the other brushing the spot behind her ear. He saw it then, the faint scars, not new. Judge Silas, she said, voice hollow. He killed my brother, took what was ours, said I stole from him when I ran. You didn't? She looked up. Only thing I took was my name back. Clay nodded. That's worth more than silver. She crossed the room, slow. You didn't have to lie for me. I didn't lie, he said. I told him the truth. There ain't no Apache girl here. She searched his face, like looking for cracks that weren't there. Then what am I? You, he said. You're Tula. You're the woman mended my shirt and made stew with no words and held this roof together when it might have caved. He didn't touch her. Didn't need to. I can leave, she whispered. Before they come back. His voice was steady. If you leave, it won't be 'cause you had to. It'll be 'cause you wanted to. Outside, the rain thickened. Inside, the silence turned sacred, and somewhere, under the storm and the weight of memory, something unspoken took root. The morning after the rain smelled like iron and cedar. A hush fell over the mesa, like the land itself was holding its breath. Clay stood near the barn, tightening the cinch on his saddle. Tula watched from the porch, wrapped in the same old shirt she'd mended days ago. It fit her now, not because it was hers, but because this place no longer belonged to just him. It belonged to both of them, even if it wouldn't be theirs for long. They'll come back, she said quietly. He didn't turn. I know. They won't ask next time? He nodded once, slow and steady. I won't either. She crossed to him, bare feet sinking into the soft mud. You don't have to do this. He finally looked at her. There was no fear in her voice, just weight. And love, though she hadn't said it. He hadn't either. Folks like them didn't name such things. They proved it. I've been hiding behind fences and dust for too long, he said, letting men like Gant walk around thinking they can brand people like cattle. Tula touched the side of his face. They don't see you, not the way I do. He caught her hand, kissed her fingers. I ain't just standing up for you, he whispered. I'm standing up for the man I should have been years ago. They rode out together, Clay on his old sorrel gelding, and Tula riding bareback like wind over stone. They didn't speak much. Didn't need to. The road to Red Mesa carved between buttes like a scar that never closed. At the edge of town, they stopped. The sun was high, burning through the last of the storm's breath. Are you sure? She asked. No, he said. But I'm done being sure. Now I'm just going to be right. They walked in. Eyes followed. From behind barrels, shop windows, swinging saloon doors. Tula kept her chin high. She didn't shrink anymore. Gant was on the courthouse steps, leaning like he owned the sky. Two men flanked him. Boone and Harper again, hands close to their holsters. Gant's eyes found Tula and lit like a snake tasting heat. "Well," he drawled, "ain't this a sunrise I didn't expect?" Clay didn't slow. "You got no right putting a price on her." "She's property," Gant sneered. "Marked, tagged, traded fair and square like any cattle." Tula stepped forward. "Then brand me again." The crowd murmured. Gant blinked. "Go on," she said, pulling her braid aside, exposing the scar. "Make your mark, Judge. Show them what kind of law you serve." His smirk faltered. "You ain't got the guts," Clay said. "You hide behind titles and guns and pretend that makes you a man." Boone shifted. "You draw, Vance, and you're a dead man." "I didn't come to draw," Clay said. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a folded paper. "This is a land deed, signed by Old Man Whitaker before he passed. This town's courthouse sits on Apache land, her land." Gant's face paled. "I reckon we let the law decide who's trespassing now." They left the paper on the judge's boots. Clay didn't wait for the fight. He knew it had come, maybe not today, maybe not even soon. But the truth had been planted, and truth, like mesquite, has a way of growing even in hard dirt. They rode back to the homestead in silence. By nightfall, Clay fixed the crooked gate. Tula cooked. The wind hummed like a lullaby. Later, under a sky so wide it could swallow grief, Clay carved something into the porch rail. Not her name, not his. Just one word. Ours. Sometimes, a man doesn't save a woman. He learns to stand beside her. Sometimes the West ain't just about drawing faster. It's about standing longer. So now tell me, if someone came for what mattered most to you, would you stay behind the fence? Or ride into town?